Thanks very much for the warm and welcome introduction, Steve. There's something really both satisfying and enjoyable about being an academic. Now, usually when an academic stands up in front of an audience of professionals, you see a lot of people looking down at their phones, and thankfully no one disappointed me today during the introduction. One of the things that we have to be good at is researchers, and we have to be great observers about the things that are taking place around us. And just from that particular experience, since I've learnt, having come from Australia and lived in France for 9 years, I was at the Burgundy School of Business, but I started off in the Loire, in a lovely little town called Angers, where they make Cointreau. And I picked up very quickly after living in other countries that there are completely different ways of doing everything. Business cultures are different, interactions with people are different, understandings and appreciations vary to a great degree from wherever you are. And I've picked up in the US, there is an amazing openness about both customers and people in the wine sector here, but they're very quick to turn off if you don't keep their interest. So what I'm trying to do is develop a presentation style that is both interesting and valuable, but has a great deal of information that changes throughout the presentation, so it hopefully keeps your interest for the entirety of the time that we're here. Now, I'm planning on keeping things fairly simple, fairly direct, and fairly, hopefully, useful to you all. I'm absolutely excited by what I'm seeing as the changes taking place in the wine trade. I think I, like many people probably sitting in here today, came into wine because I'm fascinated by wine. I just thought wine was the greatest product ever. I wanted to be involved in selling it. And of course, like most people who start in the wine trade, I believe that the ultimate journey in wine consumption was to be someone who would be able to drink Krug, or enjoy a glass of Domaine de la Romney Conti, or start every meal with a glass of Kistler Chardonnay. It didn't take me too long after working with my family and realising as a young man that if you are going to be any good at selling anything, focusing only on the best is not a very good way of communicating with consumers. And it's one of the unfortunate stories that we have in the wine trade. We're very good at looking down our nose at customers. And I love the title that we worked on for this, Consumers Love Bulk Wine, because that's exactly what they do. It's the trade that doesn't, and the trade is our main challenge. So the whole focus of this presentation has been about identifying for you ways in which you can identify some areas that you can reinforce the value of the product that's being put together in the bulk wine sector and the value that it can have for businesses. Because if we keep looking down our nose at people, it's not going to work very well. And in the last 48 hours, I've been to 2 conferences and had that unfortunate experience where you've got people who make wine sitting there and saying, well, if we've got people selling wine, they have to know about winemaking processes. They have to be able to determine the difference between spur and cane pruning, or they don't work in my tasting room. Now, nowhere in the sales manual of how to sell wine have I ever seen reference to a customer asking me, what's the difference between spur and cane pruning? And if you can tell me the answer, I'm going to buy a case of your product. There's just no connection. The relationship between product knowledge, as much as we value it and as much as we like it, is not a way that we're helping sell product. And having seen Bob Polinsky present this morning, fascinated by the focus in retail on creating products that customers like, enjoy, can communicate about, and will drink repeatedly. Following up with Tim Hannay this afternoon. I mean, he's not shy about the fact that the wine trade is not very good at talking customer. We focus on judging people on their skills about whether they have WSET accreditation, or if they're attempting to become a certified specialist in wine. But where and when, in that particular scenario, do we ask them about their sales skills? Do we find out what they know about customer behaviour? The cues that encourage sales, the interest that a customer has in consuming wine. Well, that's essentially what I've used as a way to try and generate this presentation and what I'm going to focus on. So to keep it straightforward and to keep it as clear as possible, I'm just going to start out with a synopsis of the wine market, just to outline what we're looking at, what information I've had at my disposal, thankfully from the supporters that we've got at the Wine Business Institute. And look at the difference in the language between the fine and the bulk wine sector. Yes, there are 2 very clear and distinct categories, but as I'm clearly pointing out and want to re-emphasise from those who saw Tim Hannay, France is very consistently regarded as a premium or fine wine exponent. France does create some amazing wines. Whether they're the best in the world is not the point, but they do have quite good control of the fine wine market. But if anyone's looked at the consumption data in France recently, certainly if you go back till pretty much about 1980, you'll see that its consumption of wine has consistently been going down. And it's been going down, it's dropped more than 70% since 1980. They drink so little wine today than they used to compared to generations ago. The worst thing about that change isn't just the drop, but it's who's drinking wine in France. In France, 80% of the wine being consumed is consumed by people over the age of 50. What's happened is that the French wine sector has failed to refresh its category. All of that decline is from people who are not coming into the category. And what they've done, in a schematic sense, is they've created this image of fine wine, but people don't start with fine wine. They have to get there somewhere. And they get there somewhere by progressing through a process of having wines that they first discover, enjoy, gain some experience, and find what they like, and then some people journey on a pathway to fine wine or luxury wine. Most people don't do that. So the whole focus of becoming a premium or fine wine producer, if that's the only arrow in your quiver, or if that's the only tool in your toolbox, you're missing the point, because consumers start with wine that is red or white or sweet or dry, whatever it might be, and then they add to it with experiences. And we forget that. Fine wine needs bulk wine. Fine wine needs simple wines, generic wines. And without them, the wine category, certainly in the US, will not continue to grow as it has done over the last 24 years. And so what we need to do is identify what those challenges are, how we can communicate more effectively, and finish off with some sales strategies for those of you who meet with the obstruction in the wine distribution channel. Now, as is my wont, I love having the interaction with audiences. But if you were my students, I'd just sit here and pick people out and say, here, answer this question for me. Instead, I think that's probably a bit rude since we don't know each other. And also, since you guys are sitting there, I want you to listen, take note, and interact with the presentation. And so having done so, what I've done is set up a platform for you for this presentation to ask me questions, so that at the end you don't get stuck by someone who grabs the microphone and then asks 20 questions and no one else gets one in. Everyone has an opportunity to interact with me as you wish to. And what you do is you look for this concept called Slido. Grab out your phone, grab out your tablet, whatever you've got, and type in SLIDO in the navigator bar, and you will come up with a page that looks something like that. When you get on that page, you see this little box which says join, and it's got event number written on it. And the event number you want is up there in the subheading, U478. If you type that in, you'll be able to ask questions and answer the poll question that I've put there for you, because I suspect most of you are looking to sell bulk wine. And many of you have probably had trouble getting bulk wine through the distribution channel. And so I'm interested in the questions you're being asked. I want to know what challenges you're facing so that I can adapt my presentation to be more suited to the interests of you as an audience. So the first task I've set for you is to answer the question that I've put there for you. So let's go through this process for you. You search for Slido on your smart device in the browser, and you click on the event field and type in U478. If you've got a smartphone, it'll come up on your screen will be this question that I've put in there for you. And after you click join, you'll see under the polls tab, if you've got a choice, you'll see a series of responses there to the question, which responses do you experience in your efforts to sell bulk wine? Essentially, what objections, what challenges have you faced in doing so? If you do that, I'll give you a couple of minutes to post your answers, and I'll have a look at the answers a little bit later in the presentation. But once you've done that, the more important thing for me, and what I will address at the end of this presentation, is a chance for you to respond to me and to ask particular questions. Once you've responded to the poll, tap on the Questions tab. Click on the Questions tab there, and you'll see it will probably still have this image in front of you saying Ask the First One. That question will be there until I get an answer to it. And there's a benefit in doing questions this way. One, everyone who wants to get on and wants to ask a question is welcome to do so. There's no moderation here. I certainly can't moderate. And secondly, I want to know what your questions are. I wouldn't even think about moderating them. So under the questions tab, type your question there to me, and thankfully everyone who gets on and has a look at it can see every other question that someone else has put on there. So not only can you ask me a question, but you can see what other questions have been put on there, and if you like what someone else is asking, you can upvote it. So what happens once I've finished going through my spiel and finished the content of my presentation, I start asking the question that is most popular to most people sitting in the audience. And if no one votes anyone else's question up, then all I end up doing essentially is just answering the questions in the order that they come. But it gives everyone a chance to ask a question, and thankfully, even if I don't have time to get through the presentation, all the questions, it gives me something to work on in my spare time, because I'll have plenty of that, and I will get back to those questions and distribute them through Sid or whomever to be able to answer the questions even after the presentation's over. If you ask a question, I will respond to it. Whether I get to do it up here on the platform or through social media or through a newsletter is entirely up to you. I'll look over them at the end of the presentation and give everyone a chance to say their piece. So without further ado, let's focus on what's happening in the wine market. Okay, this information was recently published by Wine and Vines. Wine and Vines have just put up the total US sales numbers, looking at the latest 12 months and for the month of June. And we can see things are still moving forward. They're growing slowly, but we're seeing still positive growth. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, this is the 24th year in a row where we've seen the wine market grow in the US, which is a great outcome. So I'll talk a little bit about wine imports, because that's essentially got a nice correlation with what's happening in the growth of interest in the bulk wine sector. I'll talk a little bit about market trends and what that may mean for you as a producer or distributor of bulk wines. And then finally, I'll present some insights on what these numbers mean and what the implications are for you working in this category. So starting off with the information from the Gomberg Fredrickson support, kindly been provided this information by those at BW166. John Moramarco has published this data 2 weeks ago on the report for May 2017 and leading up till the end of that month. And you can see here that the US wine market grew from being a $37 billion to $44 billion category between 2011 and 2016. So in the most recent years, basically since the nadir of the global financial crisis, we've seen nothing but growth, which is great news. Wine imports to the US grew in value from that time of 4.2 to 5.5 billion, which even outgrew the market growth over that period. So we've got some good findings already. We've got a situation which is clearly indicating that the market's growing, and secondly, that we are so short in supply, we're having to get more from foreign markets than we're getting from local markets. Now, the interesting thing for me is that blue blob at the top of that screen. That's the bulk wine imports. That certainly suggests to me that, first of all, it's a proportion of the market which is growing in size. It's also got a number of little variable little steps and cavities in it. And the interesting thing for me is that why and how they've taken place over time. What do these values tell us? Well, let's get into them. Let's look at the first one. Now you can see here, this is the first blip in what took place in the bulk wine category. And it pretty much hit us in about 1996 and grew through to 1998. And in that time, it really was just an illustration of a category which had kind of just essentially come out of nowhere. What was happening in the mid-90s, for those of you who don't go back that far, globally the wine sector was pretty much static, but the New World was increasing the number of consumers coming into the category, and pretty much if you made wine, it was flying out the door. So there was a situation in the mid-90s where there was a bit of a shortage on the local market, and so the bulk wine market was kind of created as a way to moderate or ameliorate those shortfalls until the domestic production could catch up and be able to make up the shortfall. By the early 2000s, those of you who go back that far, you'll remember about 2005, there was all this hysteria. Australia was going to take over. They were killing everyone in the global wine sector. What was going on? Australian wine is everywhere. These mad Australians with all these critter brands and everything is going to take over the wine sector. Fast forward 12 years, I'm pretty sure we can say that perhaps they took the wrong strategy. Things didn't go quite as well for Australia in that period, but they certainly, it's pretty much that period from 2003 and 2004 represent a kind of the peak wine period for the Australian wine sector. They had the highest price in the international market for their wines that they'd achieved, and all of the plantings that they'd put in place in the 90s. In the 1990s, plantings of vines in Australia increased fivefold. Went from about 75,000 acres. Acres, hectares thing, I'm kind of struggling with this one, but 75,000 acres became 424,000 acres by the end of the 2000s. So in any situation where global consumption was pretty much static over the same period, if you flood the global market with supply, unsurprisingly, what goes up eventually has to come down. And that's essentially what happened at the end of, by the end of 2006. Australia had flooded the bulk wine market because they'd oversupplied. They'd overshot what the expectations were, and they really struggled with that. Now, the interesting thing is typical economic theories would tell you that in 2008, with the financial crisis, people would be trading down. They'd be going in, why didn't they drink more bulk wine in 2008 than expected? We actually had a decline. The reason being was because all the table wines had to go down in category. Prices had to go down, and you found that there was this influx from above, from the bottled wine market, which meant that we didn't need as much bulk wine in that period. Then lead back to 2011, you've got the third peak, and that's basically the recovery from the global financial crisis, where people started coming into it. Wine is one of those economic commodities that as income increases, consumption of it increases with it proportionally. And as wealth started coming back into the country, people started getting into wine. But bulk is far more able to adapt to the changes in the market need than bottled wine, particularly people who are making wine with a cause. So unsurprisingly, as consumers wanted more wine, you saw this uptake in consumption, and the bulk wine market was best able to adapt to that. So you can see that they've kind of been, bulk offers a great solution, a great potential for the global wine market, because you've got this capacity to adapt far more readily. You're less constrained by rules and regulations. You can cater to the needs of the market, if only you know what those market needs are. So switch to domestic situation, the data from Nielsen, which was taken from 10 days ago, just on the latest information on the retail environment. And you can see here that if you look on a national basis, the one thing I am happy about here, that little Australia blob, 12 months ago when I saw this, that Australia blob was down in the bottom left corner, further down than Argentina was. And that's illustrating that the Australian wine category has turned a corner and is actually on its way back up. And I'd be concerned because there are, with any country, when it starts getting its act together and starts moving in one direction, it's much easier to build up momentum in that regard. But you can see here you've got Italy pretty much dominates the US market. Oregon's become a player as far as an increase in value is concerned. And New Zealand is occupying that nice little spot out there, which is pretty much dominated by Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc. Leading into the category changes, you can look and you can see here that the interesting thing about this particular image is that unfortunately one of my favourite grapes, Syrah, is still about as popular as Leprosy. Unfortunately, that's something which I am hoping will change in due course. The good news is it means there's more for me. I get to drink a bit much. I get to drink more of it, but unfortunately, it's still struggling to a degree. What I can't understand is how Zin is so good in this part of the world and yet is not regarded very highly by the cognoscenti. I just think it's one of those grape varieties which should be in a better place than it is and just needs some work and attention. But the interesting thing for me is in the top right-hand corner. You can see the rosé dot. That actually should be out about 3 times as far away in the top left. That category has grown in value 36% in the 12 months leading up to this. But if they do that, all the other blobs look like they're all squashed together. One of the most popular question I get from wine producers is these days is, should I be producing a rosé? I don't know. Looking at that, I think you can pretty much make the answer that question yourself. Okay, so the insights and what this means for the bulk wine category. Rosé has been touted as a saviour for more than 10 years. Remember, the wine trade is slow to adjust. We're a conservative lot. When I first started working in the wine trade, and this is going back in the late 1980s, I remember one of the first mentors who I ever worked with was telling me about the coming Riesling Renaissance. And how many of you have been told by someone in the wine trade that Riesling's on the way back? I've heard that for 30 years. Riesling is not on the way back. Consumers don't like it. They have to learn to like it. It's one of those grape varieties, despite the fact it's inexpensive, when they taste it without any experience, they think it's acidic and they don't like it. We can keep trying to tell them otherwise. It's not going to happen. We're much better off focusing on what they do like and what they're interested in, and as changes take place, to be able to follow and anticipate those changes. Yes, a small group of people do like it, but it's not there. I remember Viognier was going to be the grape variety that took over Chardonnay. How's Viognier going these days? Does anyone drink Viognier? Maybe once every 10 years? I'm not sure, but the wine trade will tell you all these amazing things about natural wine, orange wine, and how they look down their nose at things like red blends and Moscato. Don't listen to what the trade's telling you. Look at what the numbers are telling you instead. If you want to make bulk wine, you want to make sales, yes, you've got to have a language for it, but you've got to look at what the market's doing. I am surprised at how few rosés I've seen there on the trade floor. Given that that's one of the categories, and this is not that image I put up there, that's not the first time that's been showing the growth in rosé. Or Sauvignon Blanc. Don't listen to what the trade's telling you. Look at what consumers are interested in. You can have a different language for each side. Rosé has been touted as a saviour for more than 10 years. It's only just starting to take notice. So you probably don't have to do it immediately, but I would certainly be looking at it because consumers are very quick to take up something that they like. So the rosés, sparkling, red blends and Sauvignon Blanc, they're all driven by demand for new styles. As people they enjoy their Chardonnay, they enjoy their Cabernet Sauvignon, but they also like to try things new after a while. We get sick of something, human beings. They get tired of the same thing all the time. They like it, they like it, they like it, they like it until they don't like it anymore. So you need to have a degree of variety and you need to look where the market's going. But even when I was going through my education, I remember all of the lecturers telling me that Sauvignon Blanc was that horrible, reedy, green stuff from cat's pee on a gooseberry bush from New Zealand that no one was ever going to drink. 20 years later, I contacted my professor and said, do you remember telling me that was crap? I'm glad I didn't listen to you. So we've got to be up to date with what's happening. Look at what the market's doing. If you want credibility, sure, come up with something that's a Cabernet Sauvignon driven, or it might be some oak driven Chardonnay or whatever it is. But if you want to make sales, you've got to look at what consumers are interested in, and they love these wines. Focus on the styles that they're interested in, because you've got the capacity to adapt more readily than a producer who is constrained by regulations and other challenges. New consumers and economic contraction both result in apparent trading down. So we know that consumers tend to trade down, so that we know it's something you can anticipate as the market slows down, because we know it's hitting or near a plateau. 24 years of growth is very easy to make you believe that it's going to continue doing this indefinitely, and it might do. But as the market premiumises, that's going to become more difficult in due course. And it's the macro-environmental impacts that drive the bulk wine market. Looking at what the anticipated changes are in the marketplace and what impact they're going to have economically is one good way to look at what you might be producing that's going to be able to sell. Bulk wine supply is best placed to cater to these trends. You have that advantage. So if you're interested in this category and you're developing products in this category, you can adapt far more readily than those who are otherwise constrained. More and more bulk wine is being brought into the US than ever before. So that bodes well, obviously, for demand. It might make it more difficult for you with other competitors, but bearing in mind that you've got the capacity to do with that what you want. Rosé as a category, to me, represents a kind of a golden era for bulk wine producers. It doesn't matter if you've got red or white dominance, you can actually come up with a rosé anyhow. You only have to mix the two together. So you've got even more blending options. And one thing we are finding is that rosé consumers are less focused on varietal definition. It doesn't need to be a Pinot Noir rosé or Shiraz rosé. It's the style they're interested in. Look at the style, look at the colour, look at for the markets that you're looking to get into, and that's going to make life much easier for you as far as product development is concerned. And here's where we kind of get it wrong. And why, this is the language that's used by wine consumers, and this is what we always need to focus on. I took these images a couple of days ago online and took them a few hours after, I think The Bachelorette had been on TV. Now, one thing that's got me, I haven't seen The Bachelorette, and these are obviously endorsers of The Bachelorette. I only see XX chromosomes up there, so clearly there might be a gender skew here, so I apologise for putting up data that's just based on one side. But when people are talking about wine, what they talk about is something emotive. They talk about how it makes them feel, how it makes them, the positive impact that wine can have on them. And here you've got a situation of a romantic image, and the quotes are talking about, if you can't jam, if you can't dance to strawberry wine with me and my friend, we can't be friends. Sad is the word used with this, and that's why I'm drinking wine. This is what I'm like after wine. I deserve a glass of wine. These are emotive cues. This is how wine makes us feel. This is how consumers talk about wine. And if you look down at things like the likes and the retweets of just these messages a few hours after the topic's gone online, you can see there are a lot of people who are endorsing this point of view. I had a look at a number of the followers and retweets on those, and they were typically people who weren't wine-related. These were their friends. These were people who they were related to. On the other hand, you get this. This is the language used by the wine trade. This is from Wine Spectator, the #1 by readership of wine magazine in the world. And here's, in twice a period of time, here is a tweet which, just one example, that was retweeted only 5 times and had 7 people like it. And when you look at those retweets and likes on both of those images, they're from people in the wine trade. They're not getting more people into the category. So the only interest, if you talk about wine as a technical thing, if you're talking about the rules, the regulations, you are talking to yourselves. You're not getting people into the category. Completely different from the way consumers talk about wine, and something that we need to address. So what does this mean? Tech speak doesn't attract wine consumers. We're speaking another language to them. We've got to learn to change that. We need to talk consumer, and we need to convince the trade. Volume of the category continues to grow, and one of the challenges is we're dealing with at the moment. Since 2011 in the US alone, we've got a reduction in wine consumption per capita. Now, what that means in a net sense is that we're getting more people into the category than the size of faster than the size of the category is growing. And so what this means is we're getting people in successfully, but we're not getting them to consume frequently enough, or they're not trading up enough. And I think that's a sign of a problem. This whole idea of premiumisation seems appealing because you get better margin on it. But the problem is that if people work their way up the curve in the premium sector, and they don't get the capacity to gain the experience from what wine's like, they end up feeling they're distant. If they look up at the peak and they see the peak as being far beyond them, they will never come into the category. And that makes it difficult for all of us. New consumers want consistency and familiarity of products, so that's what you have to focus on. So avoid using things like trade terminology and focus on what wine means to them and how it makes them feel. So last slides, how do we sell it? First of all, the market wants it. Supply can't keep up with demand. We're getting more people into the category, and fine wine advocates are going to beg to differ, because this is who we're dealing with, unfortunately, to a great degree in the trade. Premiumisation isn't the enemy. It's just we need to make sure we've got the laddering process to keep people working up the channel. So I'll have a look at your Slido responses afterwards, but I just wanted to finish with these slides. First thing, with what your responses are, there were 4 questions for you. One of the main responses you'll get is that the wine needs to be cheaper. You know what? No one ever wants to pay more money. Doesn't matter what your offer is. You've just got to be aware of the fact that whenever you're trading away anything to do with the price of wine, and when you're talking in a category where a percentage of a cent can actually mean the difference between profitability and breaking even or not, you really need to be very careful with this. But no one ever wants to pay more money. So if you're dealing with the bigger producers, you've got to maintain the things that they are interested in, such as consistency of supply, volume of product, and ability to meet their delivery terms and needs. If you're smaller, they want information, so you need to be able to provide that for them. Not your style. This is one of the first responses, or most common responses I hear from people in the trade. I don't like it. That's not me. It's not the sort of thing I'd be interested in. It's not about you. It's about who's going to drink the wine. Focus on the characteristics that make it popular. This isn't particularly my style of girl either, but I can still see that she's quite attractive all the same. Focus on the characteristics that are popular with the consumer. If you focus on consumer demand, trade numbers, you can be far more successful at selling either way. Shortages. Even the biggest suppliers. I was talking to James Davis, the chief buyer at wine buyer at Tesco last week. And even he was telling me that when you're talking about shortages, if they have something that they want, if they can see it's satisfying the demand in a market, they will allocate the places that it goes to, whether it's a regional distribution or whether it's to a particular part of their chain. Make sure that you've got the capacity to supply, even if you have to get the product from elsewhere, because you're not constrained by regional differences there. And last of all, it's unheard of. If it's unheard of, that just means that it's popular with people who aren't you. Sell the advantage of it being unheard of. Talk about the people who do know about it and how they can be valuable to you. So, it's a summary of what I'd presented. I wanted to go through these things here, and I'll put up the questions that are up on the board. But because we're out of time, I'm going to have to deal with these questions afterwards. So I'll deal with. Here are the queries you've got there. Can you address opportunities and challenges for bulk wine retail in the online space? Yes, and I'm writing an article on it at the moment, so I'll point you to that one. How can a bulk wine product move beyond private label to real brand? Depends on whether you need to. Depends on what your strategy is. Is it cheaper to import bottled wine or wine in bulk and bottled domestically? Again, it depends on the situation as it allows. I'll get to the rest of the questions, knowing that there are, how many have we got up there? There are 8 questions at least, and you're more than welcome to put more up there, but I'll interact with Sid and make sure I get a chance to get those answers to you in due course through the appropriate medium. Thank you very much for listening, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry I went over time for the next presenter. Best of luck. I hope you enjoy the rest of the show.